Nicole?
Jeremy Bash, let me ask you to pick up on what Kelly O just detailed. There is this scenario, and I'm sure this fear, that if they're not stopped, if the response is sort of America's political morass, doesn't that embolden Russian hackers and anyone else that wants to meddle in our elections? I mean, if they watch us fighting amongst themselves, I heard in today's testimony in pretty clear terms that makes us weaker and them stronger. How can the people do their jobs who are tasked with protecting us do so when we're divided amongst ourselves about whether or not it's actually happening?
Yes, Nicole, I couldn't agree more. The failure to acknowledge the threat undermines the role and responsibility of those who stand watch and guard to protect our country. If I were advising the White House, Nicole, I'd say, look, embrace this finding that Russia meddled. It's a consensus finding of the intelligence community. We got more irrefutable evidence about it today, as if any were needed. By embracing that finding, you're not embracing a finding of collusion. You're certainly not embracing a finding of obstruction of justice. But somehow the president has not given his team even the ability, the permission to acknowledge that. It's almost as if he is worried that if anybody looks too closely at just the meddling issue, they're going to find other things that will be politically problematic for him.
Ken Delaney, let me get you to pick that up, and I'm going to put you on the spot here. In your private conversations with folks in the intel community and the national security apparatus, these are patriots, these are people who the country, not one party or the other. What is their gravest fear about a hearing like today landing on deaf ears at the White House?
Well, honestly, their greatest fear is that we are unprotected against what they expect will be another round of even more serious Russian attempts to interfere in the election, to attack the democracy, to destabilize. I mean, there's a couple of different vectors here. One, we've done nothing to deter Russian behavior in a national security sense. And then, two, we've done nothing to prevent the spread of fake news. There's no effort to work with the technology companies to handle that situation, the spread of bogus stories. And then three, the election security, the stuff they talked about today. There are huge vulnerabilities. There is no federal effort ongoing to provide greater funding and greater security for these multiple state election systems that are incredibly vulnerable. So that's the fear, that it's going to happen again, and we're not doing anything about it.
Kelly O, I know that Republicans feel like they got themselves on the right side of the Russia question in the 98-2 vote for sanctions. I heard a lot of Republican senators talking about their vote. Do you see Republicans getting a little more steel in their spine on the question of Russia as they watch the Trump White House sort of wrap itself around its own axle around the politics of this? I mean, there are patriots in the Republican Party, too, who have for decades worried about Russia's attempts to meddle in the democracies of its own neighbors. Do you see more enthusiasm to get stronger on Russia, or do you see people sort of scuffling away from you in the hallways on the Republican side?
I think it's one area where they don't feel there's necessarily any blowback coming from the White House, because senators in particular who have long histories with this, other lawmakers on the House side who have a strong feeling about this, can talk about Russia as a national security issue with a certain bit of sort of grounding here. It's not like the politics of health care, which has a lot of other difficulties of negotiation to work with the White House, for example. When it comes to national security issues, I think they feel a bit more certain. They also have their own elections to be concerned about, so this is a relevant issue for anyone who's holding elective office and for their individual states. One of the things we learned when I covered the case of the recount in 2000, and I was actually in the courtroom for some litigation about voting machines, we were also stunned in 2000 about the maintenance of voting machines, the money that's not available, because states have so many other things to put their resources toward when it comes to all of the things that a state must pay for. So often election systems don't get the attention that they need. At the same time, as Ken was making the point, states don't necessarily want federal interference in their elections or an overlook of the federal government when states control that. So there are problems built into the system that make this difficult. It's expensive. It requires a level of expertise and public commitment. So when you're talking about just the Russia piece, you definitely hear senators feeling comfortable saying they have concerns about Russia. They want to send a message to the White House about Russia, and things like sanctions are one mechanism they get to do that.
All right, Kelly O, thank you so much for making some time for us. Ken and Jeremy are sticking around and joining our panel today. Michael Steele, a former advisor to Jeb Bush and former spokesman for House Speaker John Boehner, news and finance anchor at Yahoo, Bianca Golodryga, a Russia expert in her own right, and Washington Post opinion writer and MSNBC contributor Jonathan Capehart. Jeremy, while we still have you up, I wanted to come back to you on this question of, obviously not one of us has any of our security clearances anymore, but if you were to guess what's in the Intelligence Committee assessment of the current state of Russia's attempts to ultimately have the capability of impacting or changing or altering the outcome of an election, what would you guess Russia's determination is to do that?
Highly capable, highly motivated, probably the best capability to conduct cyber attacks against voting systems of any nation state in the world. China would be up there as well, but I think Russia would certainly have that motivation and that capability. And it was really interesting because in Jay Johnson's testimony today on the House side, he said he tried to get the states to acknowledge that they need to be part of critical infrastructure, and they pushed back. They said, we don't want to have a federal takeover of elections. Well, come on. I mean, that's kind of an interesting, historic, and I understand the rationale for it view, but when we're up against nation states, I think we have to realize that our democracy is vulnerable, and I think some of these state election systems have to come to the federal government and